is to take with the knight here. The other is to play d3, because after rook c b2, you take here, take here, take here, and then just rook a8, and black is doing very well. But Robbie, instead of playing d3, goes knight takes c4. And Hikaru has to be careful because this is hanging now on a3. So he goes rook d1. And perhaps it was at this moment that black should take here. I believe Hikaru would have taken, take rook d4, and the position, although slightly better for white, would have been equal. But look at what Robbie has done. He's sacrificed an exchange. Insane. And you can see Hikaru is slightly surprised. He's like, what? Why did you sacrifice an exchange? I don't understand. And you can see that expression on his face. Okay, Robbie wants to take here. But the point is, you've given up a rook. And it's not like the position does not have open files. Well, it's actually a very big gift for Hikaru, because, you know, all this while he was trying to create play, trying to get counterplay, and hoping that he could sort of do something in the position. But now with this exchange sacrifice, he has to do nothing. He has to just keep control. d3 played, but of course just rook c3, don't hurry. And after rook c3, oh, he goes rook a2, which is also playable. And now when the knight moves away, you can chop off this pawn. And that's exactly knight g6 played by Robbie. And now rook takes b3, d3. Yes, he takes the pawn. Okay, if you look at the position objectively, black has a knight and a pawn for a rook. However, the existence of these two pawns gives white a big winning chance, because if you trade off these two pawns, the knights would do very well because pawns are only on one side of the board. But the moment you have pawns on both sides of the board, the rook becomes so much superior to the knight. Knight d5 played by Robbie here. And how does Hikaru create play? a4 is not really working because you're trading pawns. So he goes knight to c3, which is a very logical move. And he wants to trade the knight because otherwise the b5 pawn is hanging. So knight takes knight. And now the rook will take the knight. Yes, rook takes c3. And now this knight is shaky. Now a4 becomes a real threat because then the knight would be hanging. So he plays rook a6, putting pressure here. Also, very careful on how do you want to proceed here as white. Hikaru goes rook to b3. And now a very important thing to notice here is that this pawn needs to be protected. So rook a5 must be played at all cost. Robbie has 10 minutes to work this out, and he mustn't hurry to make his move. He goes king f7 with just 30 seconds of thought. And this is not a good move, because now the problem is that after rook takes pawn here, firstly you cannot take with the knight because then it would be a pin. So actually Hikaru takes, and now this is a very important thing to learn from this game. So first Hikaru takes the pawn. Now you need to take this with the rook, as we mentioned, because knight takes runs into rook b3. So rook takes. And now once you take with the rook, look at what Hikaru does now. Takes the rook, knight takes back, and this position would be a draw if the knight was back there. But rook c5, rook standing one square diagonally to the knight, dominates the knight here. You can see the knight does not have good squares. It's trying to escape now. Imagine if the knight went here, players could almost sign the score sheets. It's a draw. But Hikaru plays knight pawn to f3, which means that once again, even though the knight is trying to escape, you've taken away a very key square from it. Rook goes back to b3, and now the threat is to go king here, and actually trap the knight in some ways. e5 played. The pawn is coming in to help the knight, and that's good thinking by Robbie. because pawn to e4 is important. Yes, good move, because now the knight takes pawn. If you take the pawn, there would be a fork, but Hikaru has seen it all. He plays pawn to f4 and the game is over. You know this from the body language of Hikaru. Of course, you shouldn't be impacted by the opponent's body language so much, but even the position clearly tells us that black is now lost. King e3, and Hikaru, this is easy for him because he's going to take the pawn on e4. Then he's going to move in with his rook, push the black king back, and eventually create a zugzwang like situation where black does not have any moves. This is bread and butter for a player like Hikaru. He can do this all night. Knight h4, and now king takes e4. He can just chop off the pawn. Yeah, takes the pawn. And also for black to trade pawns is not possible. It's almost impossible that he gets to trade the pawns. And knight goes back to g6. Rook check maybe. Rook to c7 check could be an idea. He plays pawn to f5. The knight is being now just sent away. Where does it go? Robbie plays his knight to f8, and the king can keep moving further in. Or actually, you can start off with a rook check. Well, Hikaru decides that he wants to play pawn to h4. And actually, even though this position does look completely winning, it would be instructive to see how to win it, because it's not so simple. Like if you give a check, the king moves here. If you give another check, the king moves back. If you come up forward, the knight gives you a check. So there's still some sort of fortress like possibilities. Rook check, and now you'll see that the g pawn is hanging here on g7. So the king has to move. King f6 played, and now Hikaru can give another check to push the king away backwards. And maybe this was the reason why he played h4, so that when this check is given, the king cannot go to g5. That square is controlled by him. So the king comes back to f7, and maybe it's time to take even more space with h5. Yes, the pawn moves forward, and maybe the next move is h6, creating a passer on the f file. He plays his pawn to h6, and Hikaru now ready with his next move, and I think this is the move which creates the breakthrough. He goes f6. Very nice. If you take the pawn, then the king moves in. Rook will take this pawn. Rook check. King will enter here. It is losing. So he goes g6. But now, if you think about it, black hardly has any moves. Like, yes, taking here doesn't make much sense, but rook a6, and now it's losing, because if you move the king away, h takes g6 and king f5. If you play the knight here, h takes g6 is coming, and so Robbie resigns here with the final move. What a nice game by Hikaru, actually.